Have you ever wondered, who would Jesus vote for? Like, if Jesus was here today, who would he vote for, or what would he vote for? How would he vote on the issues? The presidential election, the Senate election, some of the local elections and issues. How would Jesus vote? Now, in one sense, that's kind of a silly question, because Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, and he lived in a time and a place where there was no voting, right? There was an emperor, and the emperor got there probably by stabbing someone in the back, literally. And they would become the emperor, and then they ruled over all. No one voted whether they liked the emperor or not, and the emperor did whatever they wanted, because Jesus lived in the time when Rome ruled the world. And so even in Judea, where Jesus was, they were under the thumb of Rome. And yet, at the same time, there were political issues going on in Jesus' day. There were some hot-button topics that people argued about. Now, under the rule of Rome, the Jewish people were allowed to have their own group of rulers, known as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was largely made up of two different groups. You had the Pharisees and you had the Sadducees. Now, the Pharisees, they were super conservative. They were all about following the law of Moses. They wanted to keep things the way they had always been, and they were fiercely anti-Rome. So if we were going to translate that into today, we would say they were conservative and they liked small government, not big government. The Sadducees, they were the liberals. They kind of looked at the law of Moses and said, good suggestions, but we don't have to live by that. And they were very pro-Rome. The reason they were pro-Rome was because Rome had given them power. So the Sadducees actually had the upper hand in the Sanhedrin. Now, this sounds a little more familiar to us, doesn't it? Two different parties at odds with each other. And we always think, when we hear Pharisees and Sadducees, we always think, yeah, they were buddies, just all out to get Jesus together. They actually hated each other. There was nothing they ever agreed upon except for one thing: they all hated Jesus. And so what they would do is, as Jesus would go around in his teaching ministry, either the Pharisees or the Sadducees would approach him and ask him kind of a gotcha question. And often these questions were designed to force Jesus to take a side. Right? So, Jesus, are you going to side with the Pharisees, or are you going to side with the Sadducees? Because as Jesus grew in popularity, what they were discovering was a lot of people like this guy, so maybe we should get this guy on our side. And so they would ask him these questions. One of the most famous questions that they asked him, and one that is actually relevant for us today, is in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. They come to Jesus and they say to him, Jesus, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, do you understand how the different parties would have answered this question, right? The Pharisees would have said what? They would have said, no, taxes are immoral. We should not give any money to Caesar. We should not give any money to Rome because Rome is immoral. They're anti-God. They're anti-law of Moses. They're terrible. And the Sadducees would have said, no, absolutely. You should pay taxes because that's how things get done. And we're pro-Rome, and Rome helps us, and Rome's our friend. So you should, of course, pay taxes. So now Jesus has to answer this question. Jesus, are you going to side with the Sadducees, or are you going to side with the Pharisees? Right? And these are the questions we would like to ask Jesus today. Jesus, are you going to side with the Democrats, or are you going to side with the Republicans? Who would Jesus side with? Well, guess what? As he did almost every time, Jesus didn't pick a side. Now, there were some times in his ministry when Jesus said things that aligned with the Pharisees' way of thinking. And there were some times in his ministry when Jesus said things that aligned with the Sadducees' way of thinking. But Jesus never fully endorsed either party. And in fact, look at his answer here. He says, give them to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And the Sadducees are like, yeah, we got Jesus on our side. And then he says, and to God the things that are God's. And the Pharisees are like, yeah, he's on our side. Now this is a layered answer from Jesus, right? Jesus says, look, you should give to Caesar what's Caesar's. And the way he got here is, you remember in the story, he said to somebody, Okay, anybody have a coin? Anybody have a coin? And somebody pulls out a coin. He's like, whose picture's on the coin? And they're like, Caesar's. And then give that to Caesar, right? And the point Jesus was trying to make was that Caesar has created this currency. And because we have this currency in the Roman Empire, we're all able to trade with each other. So you can go anywhere in the Roman Empire and you can trade and know you're not getting ripped off because we all share the same currency. So if you're benefiting from Caesar's currency, then you ought to pay taxes to Caesar. Additionally, you had roads going everywhere, and you could travel anywhere in the Roman Empire, and you could do so quite safely because the Roman army was everywhere enforcing the safety and peace of the Roman Empire. And so what Jesus was essentially saying is, look, if you're gaining a benefit, then you ought to pay the tax. That makes sense, right? But then he says this, he says, but you also have to give to God what is God's. Well, let me ask you a question. What belongs to God? That's the right answer. Everything, right? Everything belongs to God. And so if Jesus says, give to God what belongs to God, what is it that we're supposed to give to him? Everything. So how can I give my money to Caesar if I'm supposed to give everything to God? And the answer is this. I ought to give my money to Caesar in a way that gives honor to God, even if Caesar doesn't honor God. And he didn't, right? This was in a time when Caesar was far from God. But yet Jesus says you need to honor Caesar by honoring God. And there's something here for us also. We don't live in Rome. In fact, we live in a much better time than Rome because we actually have a say in how we vote and how our country is run. We can choose our leaders, and we can choose to replace our leaders, and we can vote on policies, and we don't always win and we don't always lose, but we have that opportunity, we have that privilege. And so the question becomes for us, how do I mirror Jesus' approach? Jesus' approach is, I'm not going to take a side. I'm not going to fully endorse either one of you, but what I am going to say is whatever you do, however you engage in politics, there are two things that must be true. You must honor your authorities, and you must honor God. Now, this isn't the first place in the Bible where we see this principle. If we go back into the Old Testament, we see this used there as well. If you have your Bibles, open them to Jeremiah chapter 29. All right? Jeremiah chapter 29, and let me start reading in verse 1. It says, "This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining exiled elders, the priests, the prophets, and all the people Nebuchadnezzar had deported from Jerusalem to Babylon." So if you remember in Jerusalem's history, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came along and destroyed Jerusalem. He tore down the walls, took all the gold from the temple, destroyed the temple, and carried captives off with him. And so a vast number of Jewish people were deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. And now these people are stuck living in this foreign land. Now, understand that Babylon is not a good place. Nebuchadnezzar is not a good guy. He is a godless leader. He's an emperor like Caesar. And the people of Babylon do not worship God. They worship false gods. So it's a place full of idolatry, led by wicked people. Does that sound familiar? Because that's where we're living today. It's not a one-for-one. I lost my word there. It's not. Thank you. It's not a one-for-one comparison. But we are living in Babylon today. More often than not, we are led by people who are opposed to God, or who at least don't honor him. And most of the people around us worship false gods. We don't worship like Marduk or Baal or Ashtaroth. We worship prosperity and comfort and wealth and popularity. And we're often willing to make great sacrifices to those false gods. But we, in many ways, live in Babylon. In fact, we would even say that as Christians, we belong to the kingdom of God, and so this world, this kingdom, this nation, this is not our home. We're just passing through. And so whatever it is that Jeremiah has to say to these captives is actually very relevant to us, because just as they were living in Babylon then, we also are living in Babylon today. So let's see what Jeremiah says. Verse 4. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Let's not go any further. Let me point that out. God says, I deported you. Think about this. The people who were living in Babylon were living there because God wanted them there. He had something special he wanted them to do. They were in a place that was hostile to their value system. They were in a place that didn't worship the same God as them. They were being led by rulers who hated their gods and hated them. But God had them there for a purpose. And the same is true for us. We are here for a purpose. We live in America, in Ohio, in 2024 for a purpose. God has us here for a reason. We shouldn't miss that. This is what God says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. I don't know if you've ever built a house, but building a house takes time, right? It takes time to build something. Now, I know you can actually order houses on Amazon these days. I don't know how I would feel about living in a house that I got from Amazon. Like, does the driver show up with a clipboard and says, who's going to sign for this house? I don't know how that works. But normally, building a house takes time, right? This is going to be a theme for us. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. If you've ever planted anything, you know that you don't eat the produce the next day, right? I don't put the seed in the ground and then the next day I get to eat. It takes what? It takes time. This is the picture that Jeremiah is communicating to these people. Build houses, live in them. Plant gardens, eat their produce. Essentially what he's saying is, you're going to be in Babylon for a while. He keeps going. He says, find wives for yourselves. For some people, that takes a long time. And have sons and daughters. So from the time you find a wife till you have the son and daughter takes at least 9 months, right? If you had to do the math right. Find wives for your sons. Whoa. So now we're talking about decades, right? So I have a son, and my son found a wife, and it took him about 25 years, right? But from the time I found my wife and got married to the time my son found his wife was almost 3 decades. And so what Jeremiah is saying, you're going to be in Babylon for a while. Some of these people are starting to do the math, and they're like, is he saying we're going to be here for generations? That's what he's saying, because look what he says next. Find wives for your sons, give your daughters to men in marriage, so that they may bear sons and daughters, grandchildren. Multiply there, do not decrease. Now, a couple things about what Jeremiah is saying here. Number one, he's saying to the people, you're going to be there a while. Now, Jeremiah actually knew they were going to be there probably 70 years or more, right? Some of them would be there longer, spend the rest of their lives there. You're going to be there a long time. And Jeremiah is saying, so you need to live your life. Don't just get depressed and spend the rest of your life mourning about what you've lost. Don't spend all of your time looking around saying, these people aren't like me, I just don't want to be here anymore. Stop complaining, live your life. Don't withdraw, be engaged, live your life. And then he says this, multiply there, do not decrease. God's plan for his people is always that they multiply. This starts in Genesis 1. The very first thing he says to Adam and Eve is what? Multiply. Make more of yourselves. Remember when the children of Israel were slaves in Egypt? What did they do? They multiplied until they were a great nation. Here God is saying to them, while you're there in Babylon, I want you to do what? Multiply. Jesus changes this command in Matthew 28. He says what? Go and make disciples. Multiply. Jesus, God, is all about multiplying. He wants us to be all about multiplying because as the people of God multiply, that's good for society. That's good for culture. Do not decrease, he says. And look what he says next. Verse 7. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive. Now, notice that pursue is an action word, right? You can't sit in your lazy boy and pursue something. You can't just mindlessly stream things and pursue something. This actually takes action. He's saying, I want you to actively pursue The well-being, now that word well-being is the Hebrew word shalom. And oftentimes when we hear shalom, we think peace, and we should. And he is saying actively pursue the peace of the city. But sometimes shalom also means plenty. Pursue the plenty of the city. Now notice this whole passage together. You see, building is good for the city. Planting is good for the city. Multiplying is good for the city. You notice in here, he really focuses on this idea of building families, of planting yourself in a community where you focus on generation upon generation upon generation, where you're multiplying the goodness of God that he's done in your family onto your children and your grandchildren. Because in God's plan, good, healthy families are good for the city. They're good for the state. They're good for the country. They're good for the world. So he says, multiply there, pursue the well-being of the city. Now, if I'm living in Babylon at this time, and I'm one of the Jewish people who was deported from Jerusalem, I'm raising my hand. I'm saying, I got a question. I have to pursue the well-being of this city? These are the people that destroyed Jerusalem. These are the people that kidnapped us and hauled us way over here, and we may never see our homeland again because of these people. And you want me to pursue the good of their city? Well, it's even more than that. Pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray for the people who destroyed Jerusalem. Pray for the people who destroyed the temple. And if God could tell his people to pray for those people, then who can he tell us to pray for? You can pray for a Republican. You can pray for a Democrat. You can pray for the person you're not going to vote for. You can pray for the person who's currently in office. Go on down the list. Pray for them. Why? Well, there's a really practical reason he gives. He says, for when the city thrives, you will thrive. He says, it's good for you. Look, you're going to be there a while. You're going to be there for maybe the rest of your life. So build, so plant, so multiply. Pray for the city. Seek the good of the city, because if the city goes well, you goes well. You goes well? Hey, look, people, we haven't had power for days in my house, all right? So I'm preaching on fumes. Be glad you're here, because who knows what kind of a train wreck the next service might be. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. If the city does well, we do well, right? So here's the thing. We today have something that the people in Babylon then didn't have. And we today have something that Jesus didn't have. And that's a vote. So doesn't it make sense that if the people here in Babylon were to build and to plant and to multiply, to pursue the good of the city, and if Jesus himself said, look, you use what you have to pay Caesar what he's owed, but also give everything to God, so honor Caesar in a way that honors God, then does it make sense that I should use what I have to do those things? And what I have is a vote. So how can I use my vote to do what Jesus taught and to do what the people here in Babylon were taught to do? And I would suggest this principle. Use your vote to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible. This is what it means for us, we who live in modern Babylon, to seek the good of the city. You notice what I didn't say. I didn't say use your vote to vote for the person you like the best. Use your vote to vote for the person who gives the best speeches. Use your vote to vote for the person you'd most like to share a meal with. Use your vote for the person who's going to do what's best for you. That's a tough one. That's actually not what Jesus would say. He would say, use your vote to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible. Seek the good of the city. Pursue the good of the city. Use your vote to pursue the good of the city. So how can I do that? We'll talk about that in a little minute. But let me take a time out for a second. Because I think it makes sense that if my goal is to vote in a way that does the most amount of good for the most amount of people, then I ought to live that way too, right? Doesn't it make sense that if that's how I vote, that's how I should live? If I want to pursue the good of the city, remember that takes action. I can't be passive. I can't be apathetic. I have to actually be active. That I should live in a way that does the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And so very practically, let me just talk about our church for a second, okay? Very practically, we vote for the same reason that we do community outreach. One of the big things that we do here is we call it community outreach. We try to serve the city. And we're not doing this so that more people will come to our church, because our assumption is the people we're serving won't ever be here, and that's okay with us. The reason we do community outreach is because we want to pursue the well-being of our city. And so when we have a group of people that go to Family Promise, and they help get it ready for new residents, or they're cleaning it up, or they're helping out in different ways there. Well, we're not doing that because we get anything out of it. We're doing it because we want to pursue the well-being of our city. And by the way, there's another opportunity coming up in early October to do some work at Family Promise, so keep an eye out for that. A few years ago, we decided to get involved with an elementary school in Miamisburg. And so we adopted a teacher at Mark Twain. And then that adopted teacher became an adopted classroom, became a whole bunch of adopted classrooms, became the whole school. And our thought was never that, oh yeah, a bunch of people from this school are going to come to the church. I don't think anybody has. But that's not the goal. The goal for us is to pursue the well-being of the city, generationally. Now let me be offensive for a minute, okay? I'm Gen X. Right? The forgotten generation. Everybody knows about the boomers and the millennials and the Gen Z. There's also this other generation in the middle called Gen X, and nobody ever thinks about us. Okay? That's me. And I'm hitting that point in life, right? I'm on the back end of life, and so I'm turning into curmudgeonly old get-off-my-lawn guy, right? I am. And so I sometimes look at millennials, and I'm like, oh. And then I see Gen Z, and I'm like, oh, they're worse. Right? And those of you who are my age, you know what I'm talking about, right? I want to be a person, though, who's investing in the next generations, right? And we want to be a church that's not just complaining about the next generations, but is saying, hey, let's invest in their well-being. Let's see what we can do to help them. And here's the cool thing about what's happened with our partnership at Mark Twain. And some of the things you guys have done are amazing. Like we did coat drives and socks and gloves. And 2 years ago, they needed games for winter, for recess. And we put a list out on Amazon, and you guys bought more than enough. And every single classroom in the school got a whole bunch of table games that they could use during recess. Every Friday, or one Friday a month, somebody goes over to the school and walks up and down the halls with the sunshine cart. And the teachers get to come out and get snacks and drinks, and it really makes their day. And it's this awesome thing we're doing. But that partnership has gone so well that we've now been invited into Mound Elementary in Miamisburg. And so now we're beginning to create that new relationship there, just as a church, because of your generosity, and it's this awesome thing. And you can be involved in it. If you'd like to help be part of it, you can scan this QR code that's on the screen, and you can be a person who is actively pursuing the well-being of our community, right? But by helping the next generation. A couple of jobs that we have right now is the Sunshine Cart. That's something you can do. But also, we need some people who are willing to show up during lunch and just help out at lunchtime. And this sounds kind of awesome, right? Because little second graders and third graders are super cute. Like in middle school, not so cute, but second and third grade, still cute. And like you get to help them open their milk and get their lunch out and get their sandwich and all that. And we just need people who can help do that and show kids the love of Jesus. If that's something you'd like to do, scan the code, write a note on your connection card, and we'll get in touch with you, help you figure that out, all right? We want to be a church. We want to be a church that is investing in the well-being of our city, because that's what Jesus called us to do. And we want to be individuals, we want to be people, we want to be citizens who are voting for the well-being of our city. On October 9th, that's in a couple of weeks here, we're going to have another deep dive. And at this deep dive, we're going to look very specifically at some of the issues in this election. And we're going to try to ask and answer the question, how is it that on this issue, I can vote to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible? So we'll talk about issues like immigration, like the economy, like education. And we'll talk about on all of these issues, what does the Bible actually say? And try to explore the principles of the Bible to help us figure out, how do I vote in a way that does the most good for the most amount of people? This morning, we're not going to dive into any specific issues, but I want to kind of just give you some ideas on what it looks like to do this. What does it look like to vote in a way that does the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And I would start by saying this. We need to think long-term, not short-term. So often, political solutions are short-term surface solutions. They want to solve the thing that's obvious, that's right in front of us, but they don't really think about the ramifications of it. Like, how is this going to help or hurt people down the road? Imagine that you need a new car. And so you start looking, you go on AutoTrader or Cars.com or whatever it is, and you scroll and you find the car that you want. And so you go to the dealer and you say, this is the car, I want to look at this car, and they show it to you, and it's everything you could have imagined. It's beautiful, it's got great interior, it looks clean, and so you say, can I take it for a test drive? And the dealer's like, absolutely. So you jump in and you're driving around and you say, I want to see what this thing can do on the highway. So you get out on the highway and you're accelerating up the on-ramp, and you know, sometimes when you're driving, you get to that place where you can feel the car is just ready to kick into another gear, and it gets there, and as it kicks into the other gear, it goes, and it starts shaking and rattling, and the dashboard just lights up. The check engine light is like flashing at you. You're like, oh boy, this is not good. So you get off the next exit, go right back to the dealer. You say, there's something wrong with this car. Like, look at the dashboard, it's lit up. The check engine light is even flashing at me. So the dealer says, okay, let me take a look at it. And he gets in there and he gets his little code reader and he sticks it under the dashboard and he looks at it and he hits a couple buttons and all the lights clear. And he gets out of the car and he says, all fixed. And you say, it's not fixed. He's like, no, look, see, there's no more lights. Check engine light's not flashing anymore. All the problems are gone. You would never buy that car. Because you would say that's a person who's focused on short-term surface solutions, not the long-term problems. And if we want to do the most good for the most people, one of the things we have to do is think long-term, not just short-term. So when I vote for this candidate, I know what it's going to do now, but what are the long-term implications of this candidate? When I vote on this issue, I understand what it is now, but what are the long-term implications of this issue? Let me really quick give you 4 things that you can look for if you want to think long-term instead of short-term. And I'm going to specifically talk about candidates, but you can apply this to issues as well if you want. Number 1, look for a candidate who talks more about solutions than problems. It's really easy to talk about problems because everybody can see problems. But you know, in your life, you don't like to hang around with people who always talk about problems, right? Sometimes I feel like saying to people, hey, look, I hear there's a problem. Are you willing to help me fix it? Nope, I just want to talk about the problem. And sometimes I feel like that's what happens in our political discourse. Here's the problem with the current administration. Here's the problem with the last administration. Here's the problem in our city. Here's the problem in our state. Here's the problem in our country. Problem, and nobody ever talks about solution. See, they want to focus on the problem so that when they make that problem go away, you feel like it's solved. But that's short-term thinking, not long-term thinking. So look for a candidate who focuses on solutions, not problems. Look for a candidate who talks more about their own plans instead of their opponent's faults. I really, really hate the way we do political commercials. And they're everywhere right now, right? You cannot escape them. Like the other night, I just want to watch the Tigers play. That's all I want. But by the way, I know the Reds didn't make the playoffs this year, but the Tigers did. And I like to think it all started way back when you guys in this service booed me because I was wearing a Tigers jersey. So thank you, right? God bless me because I suffered for him. No. So the other night, I mean, all I want to do is watch the Tigers game. And of course, I'm watching it, you know, on a Michigan station. And so I'm seeing a lot of these Michigan political ads. And so I don't know anything about these candidates, but they must be really terrible people. Because the first commercial comes on, it's like, this person is the spawn of Satan, and their desire is to bring hellfire and brimstone on everybody, so don't vote for them. And then the next person is, this person wants to eat your children. Who are these people? But doesn't it feel sometimes like this is how we do political ads? And if you want to think long term, you need to be saying, who are the people out there who are actually talking about plans? Like they actually have an idea about what a long-term solution might be, rather than just talking about how awful the other person is. Number 3, look for a candidate that talks more about hope than fear. Political candidates love to make us afraid, right? That's why they tell us, my opponent is the spawn of Satan. My opponent eats babies. Because I hear that, and I'm like, wait, I don't want to have a senator that eats babies, right? They might eat my babies. So I can't vote for them. You see, that fear allows me to be controlled. And when all candidates do is talk about fear, 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 what they're actually trying to do is control you. So look for someone who talks about hope. Specifically, the kind of hope we see in Jeremiah 29. Let's talk about building things. Let's talk about planting things. Let's talk about generational hope. Let's talk about generational prosperity. Let's talk about what does it look like for us to multiply and have more children, more families, more things going well in our community. Let's talk about what it looks like to have peace and to have plenty, because that's what well-being is. But you find very few people who are willing to talk about hope for the future. They'd rather talk about fear, because that allows them to control you. So look for someone who talks about hope. And lastly, look for a candidate who has a history, because their actions will tell you much more than their words. Politicians love to tell us things, and rarely do they actually do them. So if you want to know which candidate is actually going to do the most good for the most people, look at what they've already done. Now, not necessarily politically, right? Maybe look at how they ran their life before they were in politics. Did they live their life to help people, or did they live their life to help themselves? As a politician, have they tried to do what's best for everybody, or have they basically just done what's good for the people who are their closest supporters? Look for people who have a history, and then say, what have they actually done versus what do they actually say? So how would Jesus vote? How would Jesus vote in 2024? How would he vote in the presidential election? How would he vote in the Senate election? How would he vote in the local election or on local issues? Well, we don't know for sure, do we? Because he's not here. He was there 2,000 years ago. But he gave us a good guideline. Let's go back to where we started, Matthew 22:21. Give then to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. What do you owe to Caesar? You owe respect. You owe obedience. You probably do owe taxes. Because if you're enjoying what he provides, then you should pay those taxes. You owe Caesar your vote. You're a citizen. That's how a republic works, right? And so you owe him your vote. However, you owe God everything. So however you interact with Caesar, however you give to Caesar, you need to do so in a way that honors God. So at the end of the day, I have to be willing to ask myself this question. If I vote for this person, would I be comfortable having God standing next to me as I do it? If I vote this way on this issue, would I be good telling Jesus that that's what I'm doing? Now, guess what? God is there with you. And Jesus does know, right? And so the question is, how do I vote in a way that honors God? That doesn't defame the name of Jesus? And I think the principle that helps us do that is the principle from Jeremiah. Use your vote to do as much good for as many people as possible. And don't just vote that way, live that way. Let me remind you that God loves you. And because of his amazing love for you, he wants to fill you this week with all of his goodness. So if you'll open your eyes and you'll pay attention to what he's doing in your life right now, you will see that he's pouring in his love, his grace, his mercy, his kindness, his hope, his joy, his power, his forgiveness, so you can be full and overflowing. And as all of that goodness is poured into you, it will begin to spill out of you and impact everyone around you. And you will be a person who is showing others the love of Jesus and the goodness of God. Hope you guys have a great week. Have a great rest of your day. Hope you come back next week. We're going to talk about how to love your neighbor, even the stupid one. I shouldn't say that in church. Okay, we'll try again. How to love your neighbor, even the one who has the wrong sign in their lawn. All right, so we'll talk about that next week. I hope you'll join me for that. Until we're all together again, may God richly bless you. Have a great week.